Since my very youngest days, I was treated as a golden child. My mother heaped buttloads of affection onto me and bragged to her friends how great of a son I was. I fear my younger brother missed out because she had already spent all of the love she had on me, so to speak. I joke about this, but I am somewhat serious at the same time. His upbringing lacked much of the praise and attention I was given. When I began playing in organized sports, the rest of the world joined in. Soccer came first. It all came so naturally, and before long, I was the top-scoring member of the team. Once I discovered football, everything else went by the wayside. Posters of Brady and Bledsoe covered my walls. My large, strong hands allowed me to grip and throw the ball with a power and precision not many twice my age had. All 3 years of middle school, I remained the starting quarterback. I did so well that by high school, I was playing on par with most seniors. My prowess in sports, of course, made me very popular in school. One of my teachers called me the big man on campus. I was never lacking the attention and approval of the staff and most of my fellow students. I didn't get a free ride, though. Without good grades, I wasn't qualified to play. Luckily for me, I had always been good at most subjects, except for perhaps math, in which I scored lower B's. I had decided by my second year which college I would attend. I knew if I continued on my current path, I'd be quarterbacking for a professional team right out of college. To encompass all I had achieved, I quote a line I had once read that described a man as having the world in the palm of his hand. That's probably the best way I could describe the trajectory I had put upon myself. I was destined for success, and nothing was going to get in my way. I tell you all this in order to show just how far I was soon to fall and exactly how much I was about to lose. I was a junior. I had already been named the starter on the varsity team. When not studying, I split my time between the weight room and practice. It was just before the third game of the season when Rosalind arrived. I had my mind off somewhere else when she entered our class. I still remember it like it was yesterday. A few of my classmates were grumbling about something, and it caught my attention. I happened to look up just as she was passing near me, and her beauty was breathtaking. I can honestly say with confidence you've never seen her equal in Hollywood. The rich silkiness of her auburn hair to the sensual fullness of her lips and her porcelain skin on an inch of her image had a flaw. I gave her my heart in that moment, and I knew nothing would equal her in my life. She took her seat at the back of the class. None of the shyness that usually existed in the newly arrived student showed in her actions. The room was hers completely now, and she knew it. My focus was on her for the remainder of the period. She had to have known. My gaze would have burned right through her had my eyes been lasers. This day marked the beginning of a long downhill slide, and I would give anything to experience every second of that time again. Concentrating on anything else was impossible. Class after class, only Rosalind existed. Practice was much the same. I wasn't on a football field. I was still in that class, soaking in every inch, every curve of her body. From then on, my only thoughts were about her. I used my charm to get her address from an office worker. That Friday evening, as I led the team to another victory, my only desire was for the game to end. Afterwards, I sat outside her house dreaming about her and I, walking hand in hand through the halls as everyone watched jealously. I resolved in that moment that I would own her body and soul until the end of my life. My first action upon arriving at school that following Monday was to locate Rosalind and bare my heart to her. I did just that, but her reaction wasn't what I'd envisioned. I spoke from my heart. Every word was true, but rather than collapse into my arms, as I'd seen on TV so many times, she replied with 4 short words. I don't think so. I will admit to being disappointed, but her response left me with a ray of hope. She hadn't been cruel or mocking after all. Perhaps she had been playing hard to get. I knew I had to pursue her as a hunter pursues his prey. Maybe I would even be required to make a large sacrifice to prove my love. After all, that's the way it works in the great Hollywood films and novels. She would realize she belonged with me. I just needed to help her realize that. I searched my soul day and night for a way to make this happen. Suddenly, it hit from out of the blue. If I gave up football, she would have to see how dedicated I was to her. That day, I informed the coach of my decision. It went about as well as you would think. He was angry and yelled for almost an hour, but at the end of our meeting, he wished me well. I was elated. I had to tell Rosalind that very second. She didn't answer my text right away, but when she did, her only answer was, "Why?" The queasiness churned up in my stomach. Even after all I'd done to let her know I loved her, putting it into words still made me very nervous. "I did it for you," I said. My hand shook as they moved to push send. It was now or never. She would be left with no doubt to how I felt about her. After sending it, the time seemed to drag on forever. The hours passed with no word from her, and I couldn't take it any longer. I sped over to her house and waited outside her window. I watched as she changed for bed. Every curve, every line of her body remains with me to this day. I sent a new text to let her know that I was waiting. She appeared at her window within seconds. Seeing her in the nightgown made my heart race, and there was only one reason she would let me see her this way. My mouth was dry with anticipation. I broke into a sweat. I expected to be met with soft words, but instead she began yelling, almost screaming. Her words didn't make sense. I was confused by her behavior. It only got worse when her father came outside. I tried to explain my love for his beautiful daughter, but he was deaf to my words. Rosalind began to curse me from her window. Terrible things I don't dare repeat here. I never dreamed this could have happened. With every word, her curses knocked me lower and lower. It was a pain I'd not wish on anyone. I was so distraught I didn't hear the word police until it was almost too late. I fled just as I noticed flashing lights up the street. I laid down in my car as they passed and sped away as they pulled up to Rosalind's house. My sobs grew and grew until I was consumed by my grief. I lay curled up upon my bed wailing uncontrollably. However, as my tears began to subside, another fire kindled inside. My anger roared by the second, until it consumed any sadness I once had. By dawn, I had transformed into some sort of beast. A monster I never knew existed in me had taken control of my body. I began to rage. I thought, no one says those things to someone who loves them. They know the power they have over them. The idea of punishment fleeted in and out of my brain, briefly at first, then more and more until it set root and fostered a plan for retribution. I see now just how far I had gone. My love, if that's what you can call it, had transformed from obsession into hate. The quickness in which this occurred still terrifies me. In that day and in that time, I could only think of one thing. Revenge. She had to feel my pain. There was no other way she could learn what she had done. I entered the school that morning with a single focused purpose. My anger had clouded my mind from considering the consequences of what I was about to do. I could see the terror in her eyes as I drew closer, and I can remember feeling satisfied by this. I said nothing. I just grabbed her by the throat, both hands gripping as tightly as possible, and I knew it wouldn't take long. My grip was strong and my hands were large. I was oblivious to the grabbing and pulling of others around me. Her face took on a dark red, then almost purple hue, and I knew it wouldn't be long now. I stared into her beautiful green eyes, eyes that I had dreamed of for countless hours, and was awed by them, even as they filled with the streaking of blood. My adoration angered me even more. The next thing I remember was lying on the school floor, being held down. The din of their yells seemed muffled. I was miles away, lost in the confusing pattern of the ceiling tiles above me. I'm not sure how long it was before I was told Rosalind had survived. It appeared I had been stopped before I was able to achieve my goal. This news didn't anger me, nor was I relieved. I had become numb. It's taken me many months to reclaim the identity I once was. I was terrified to feel anything. I'd become nothing more than a frightened child. I've been fortunate enough to be sent to an institution that focuses on therapeutic rehabilitation. I'm by no means fully healed, for the lack of a better word. There still are moments where I find myself giving over to my dark side. I don't necessarily blame the entertainment industry for the way they betray relationships or the pursuit of love in a wider context. I'm responsible for the way I handle the situation. Something inside of me is broken. However, in the same breath, I do question what impression they intend on presenting. A young, naive and romantic man such as myself is inundated with talk of the so-called game, and the premise of sacrificing for love, among other trite concepts, without any real guidance from a more experienced adult or father figure. A young male often uses images from the popular entertainment around him. It is a discussion that should be had considering more boys are growing up without a positive male role model in their lives. Please pardon me for going off onto my own path. I still require a lot of work. The purpose of writing this was to recount the events that led me to my current position. My counselor and I agreed that it would be a good idea to put my story and my feelings at the time on paper. It could serve as a motivating factor for myself and others to see how far I've come in my therapy. Now that I have, it is certainly encouraging to see the progress I've made. At the same time, it shed light upon the darker side of my personality, and that has been a horrifying vision. Despite this, I'm confident I'm on the path to regaining my true self, and perhaps one day you'll recognize the brother you grew up with. I've just about written down everything I can recall from that time, and lights out is quickly approaching. I'll make a copy of this for my counselor. Mine is a little epilogue to you. Of course, I'll be sending you this version for yourself. Feel free to share it with your mom or anybody else in the family that may be curious. I've written Mom a short note just about regular stuff and sent it last week, so she should receive that soon. If you have the time, I'd like you to do something like we discussed and seek out the proper place on the internet to share this. All I ask is that you leave out my name, but I probably don't have to tell you that. I'm sure you don't normally tell people your older brother is psycho. I'd like young people to be able to read an authentic account of what goes on in the mind of someone like me without all the sensationalistic fluff. I don't seek notoriety or fame for what I've done. It is an inexcusable act against one I profess to love. My hope is that it can serve as a template for the young, a diagnostic instrument to help them recognize the same patterns in their friends or themselves and stop them before they get out of control. I'd like to think if more people had access to this type of information, things like stalking and the crimes that go with it may be able to be stopped completely or at the least greatly reduced. I'll continue to do all I can to stem the tide from here. Perhaps if enough on the outside can see this, we can create a better world for everyone. Before I moved across the country for college, I lived with my mom in Fresno, California. I love her, and she always did her best for me and my sister with what little she had, but I think she'd be the first to admit that we live in a terrible neighborhood with little opportunity to improve our situation. But I guess that's just how life is when you're teenage pregnancy with a father who just disappeared into thin air. But growing up, I always thought my mom was kind of terrible. She rarely let us play outside, wouldn't ever let us go to the store on our own. She acted like an all-around control freak whose goal was to make our lives as boring and uneventful as possible. Later in life, we had a major heart where she leveled with me about why she was so strict with us when we were growing up. After that, I understood why she was the way she was. The family next door were heavily involved in meth and gang activity, but they weren't just partying and dealing out of the family home. They were a group of seriously sadistic psychopaths who did things to the local community that could pretty fairly be described as pure evil. They got raided by the cops in the end, but not before they'd done some pretty irreparable damage to the neighborhood, and my mom opened up by telling me about one particular incident that had been the catalyst for her being so strict with us. Apparently, they used a little recruitment tactic on more than one occasion, one that involved inviting a young girl over to party before forcing her to smoke meth. They'd keep her there for days, just feeding her meth and loaning her out to partygoers. That's the least obscene way I can phrase it, but you get the idea. Then they'd threaten to tell her parents or call the cops on her, some kind of blackmail method, to keep them coming back and bringing their friends and siblings, etc. From what I understand, it was kind of a vicious cycle of like brainwashing girls, which in turn attracted more guys, which then allowed them to sell considerably more meth since lewd activity was involved. My mom also said that more than once she saw two guys carrying unconscious people out to a car, throwing them in the back seat then driving them away, and that on a couple of occasions she saw missing posters for these people tacked up around the neighborhood. I asked her why she didn't go to the cops about the family, and she actually broke down crying. She said she was constantly terrified and had multiple encounters with the family members next door who told her that if the cops ever showed up, they'd make sure that she suffered. She told me that they once warned her that they were heavily armed, had all kinds of automatic weapons inside their place, and that if the cops ever came, they'd rather all die in a shootout than be taken alive. Apparently they laughed about how they had guns so powerful that they'd rip through the neighborhood, and that our family would probably die in the crossfire or something. That was something that absolutely terrified her. We were all she had in the world, and she wanted to protect us at all costs. So the idea of us losing our lives to some horrific drug-fueled shootout, it was unimaginable. My mom was a quarter Mexican too, and she knew a few things about something called Santa Muerte, a kind of pagan figure that some people worship as like a personification of death. She said she could sometimes hear people in the backyard of the meth house invoking her name, possibly even making sacrifices, since she heard chickens walking and goats bleating. And according to her, a lot of people who worshiped Santa Muerte were connected with Mexican cartels and were not to be messed with. She didn't want to take the chance. It took her years before she was able to afford to move, and by that time I was a sophomore. But I can't even describe the relief I felt when I heard she was moving away from Fresno with my little sister. For the first time in years, I was actually excited about going home to visit. We were finally away from that psycho family of meth-addicted death worshippers. For the longest time, me and my family lived next door to these absolute insane people that made our lives a complete living hell for like an entire year. They were pretty well behaved for the first few months after they moved in, but after a while, they started absolutely blasting music in the middle of the night. I'm not just talking about that gentle kind of bass thump that passably is annoying. I'm talking the kind of loud where you couldn't get a wink of sleep. The police had to be called out a few times to get them to turn it down, and even then they confessed that they couldn't really do anything other than issue fines. They got progressively worse though, and it turned out half the reason the music was so loud was to mask the sounds of the mom and dad having these legit fistfights in the middle of the night. It wasn't even a case of it being a one-sided domestic abuse either. The dad sometimes had worse black eyes than the mom, and scratches all down his face where she'd obviously clawed him to death. They used to knock the 7 shades out of each other, but we didn't think they were too dangerous to anyone outside their own family. Once or twice my dad had gotten into confrontations with them about the smell coming from their backyard, or the fact that they used to blast music. The dad of this insane family had threatened to kill my dad once or twice, but none of us thought that he would actually go through with it, and thank God they didn't. Then for some reason it went really quiet over there for a few weeks, and it got to the point we thought that they'd actually moved. Only they hadn't moved at all. They were just keeping their heads down because they'd straight up killed their own daughter. Apparently, she tried to run away from home and ended up in a shelter somewhere. They tracked her down, dragged her into their car one night, taken her somewhere secluded, and then beat her to death. I'm not sure they even meant to kill her. They just beat her up so bad that she ended up dying not long after that. That's why they've been so quiet. They didn't want to bring down any attention on themselves when they were dealing with disposing of her body. We had police basically camped out on our street for like a week after they'd been arrested. All kinds of forensic vans with people in those full-body white fabric suits going in and out all hours of the day. They were obviously looking for traces of the girl, but whether or not they found anything I'm not really sure. I do know it was in the paper though, and like I said, I thank God the guy never did anything to my dad, because he did actually go on to murder someone, his own daughter at that. I was only 13 years old when this happened. I would be paid extra since I was going to be babysitting so many kids. I don't recall how many, but there were a lot. The reason why I was trusted with so many was because I knew them since my parents and their parents were all friends growing up, making us kind of form into a group. No, I was the oldest out of every single kid, which was the reason I was in charge. Of course, it was going to be a long night, knowing that our parents would be at some bar far away until like around 2 in the morning and then stay at a hotel. For some background, I knew the kids and they knew me. I being the oldest, 13 at the time, and the youngest being around 4. There was definitely a little bit of an age gap. The majority of the kids were around 9 to 10. Anyway, the parents left, and when they did, it was already around 4 in the afternoon. About 2.5 hours later, I made dinner for them. We sat down, and everyone ate their pasta. Because all the kids were together and they all knew each other, things got pretty crazy. I won't go into detail on exactly what went down, but some of the kids were just totally wild. I didn't really mind it though. It was pretty funny at the same time, but that's besides the point. So, after a couple more hours, it was getting pretty late. I recall it being around 11 to 30 when kids were starting to settle down. I had to take care of some of the kids who injured themselves by doing some really stupid stuff that was really dangerous, and I couldn't make it in time since I had to deal with some other problems as well. But I would consider myself a very caring and kind person because I always did what I needed to do to calm them down. So like I said, it was around 11:30 when they were starting to settle down, and then not too long after, they were starting to pass out. I brought and carried them upstairs and put half of them in one of the 2 kids' rooms. For the sake of keeping the real names out, basically we were at the house that belonged to the Abels family. Ava and Dom were the kids in the family, making it their house. I put half the kids in Dom's room and the other half in Ava's room. They passed out very quickly after that. I went back downstairs to chill out and then listen to some music. After listening to music for a while, Ava comes downstairs, and this is where things start to take a turn for the worst. I had to look because I was listening so loud that I couldn't even hear her calling my name. She then said in a really scared tone, "Something keeps being thrown at the window in my room." I'm really scared. I was a little uneasy to be hearing this since this was such a weird thing to be happening at this time of night. I gave her a hug and I assured her that everything would be all right and that I would go check it out. The bedrooms were on the 3rd floor, so this was especially weird since the room's windows were really high up. I went into Ava's room and I saw that the kids were sleeping. I guess no one else had heard the something hitting the wind down. I started to think that Ava was just making this up or something. I went back downstairs and went to the couch where Ava was. I was a bit surprised to see that Ava wasn't there. This is when I then heard something from downstairs. It sounded like a muffled girl's scream for help. I quickly ran down there to see Ava in the garage, then being dragged out of the garage by a dark figure. Someone had forgotten to close the garage door, so it was just open. I was so scared and went into full-on panic mode. I then went back inside to go grab a weapon or something that I could use in quick defense. I found this spirit-looking thing that's used for fires and also pushing wood in other areas. I picked it up and then ran outside to look for Ava. My son saw Ava and this really dark figure which was taking Ava into the backwoods. I then hit the dark figure in the back of the knee, practically stabbing the figure since I had a sharp edge on the side of it. The figure fell back and let out a yell of pain. That's when I grabbed Ava and then practically carried her back into the house. Very stupidly, I left the weapon I had outside since I was in a panic. I think that I just didn't have time to think about it since Ava was the main priority for me. I got back inside and closed the garage door, hoping that was the end of it. I decided not to call the cops because I get really nervous when it comes to cops, so I just wanted to avoid that. I ran upstairs, but tried not to make too much noise to see if any of the kids were awake due to hearing the commotion from outside. There were only about 2 kids who were awake, and they asked what was happening. I told them to just fall back asleep and that there was a situation that happened. They really wanted to know what, but I just told them I'd tell them in the morning. I really don't blame them. I think I would also want to know what was happening, especially after all that commotion. So anyway, I go back downstairs to the couch where Ava thankfully was this time, and she falls asleep with the comfort of me there the whole time. Fast forward to the morning, it's around 7:30 a.m. and I can hear some commotion from upstairs. The kids were up and playing. Ava woke me up and she was really happy to see me there. I think I really made her feel safe after that night. Me and Ava's connection was a little bit different from before as the story is becoming better. The final spook is yet to come, so get ready. I walked downstairs to see if anything had been stolen, I checked and didn't really see anything out of the ordinary. Well, nothing out of the ordinary except for one thing. There happened to be a paper that was in the garage. It was taped to the sliding door, and I think that's why I paid attention to it. I started to read it, and it said one word, revenge. I was really scared reading this because how the hell could someone have put this here? Then reality hit me. Someone had to have come inside after the garage door had been closed, which is what I thought we were safe from. I haven't shared this story with Ava because I don't want her to feel scared or threatened more than she probably already does. I do still have a few questions left unanswered though. Who did this? Why did they target this house specifically? And last but not least, did the intruder purposely try and take Ava out of everyone there? Why did he want her specifically? I know I'll probably never have my answers to these questions, but it's absolutely chilling to think about. I feel like every neighborhood has a family of absolute psychos. Almost everyone I've spoken to about this sort of thing seems to remember one group of absolute Ramuns, be it from their childhoods or from their current lives. And if there's one thing I've learned from their collective memories and stories, it's that whenever there's a family like that around, it's only a matter of time before something comes to a head or something finally boils over. And that's exactly what happened with this insane family that lived in my neighborhood when I was a kid. Only the thing is, most of the people I've spoken to said the breaking point came when some kind of family argument or confrontation with neighbors spilled out into the streets outside. Police were called, arrests were made, usually a for sale sign or two went up in the aftermath. But I almost wish my story was that simple or ended that relatively amicably. Because what happened in my case is something that haunts me to this day with possibilities and ramifications that I find genuinely terrifying. I grew up in the 70s Britain, in a pretty small town in a place called Wiltshire. We were quite a small community. Everyone knew everyone, and consequently, everyone knew everyone's business too. There was this one boy called Lewis, and he was the only child of the Prestige family. A very peculiar family name, if ever there was one, but that's not the reason I'll never forget it. The Prestige family were peculiar by name, and peculiar by nature too. But then peculiar seems like entirely the wrong word to use. Peculiar makes you think of something quaint and adorably abnormal. But there was nothing adorable about the Prestige family. They were just weird, scarily weird too, and mean. I think one of the earliest memories of Lewis is during an assembly in primary school. It's about 8 in the morning, and all the kids in school are sat in the main hall. And it's deathly quiet apart from our headmaster making announcements and the soft sobs of young Lewis. He didn't stop crying for the whole of the assembly, and it didn't just remain this quiet weeping either. His tears built in pitch and intensity until he was wailing so loud that a teacher had to remove him altogether. I remember feeling really sorry for him, but as time went on, it was just something you sort of got used to. They were the weird family in town, and since they didn't get into any serious confrontations outside of their own family unit, people just sort of let them be. The next serious incident I remember was years later in secondary school, when the schoolyard suddenly became abuzz with people gossiping over something. People were crowding around the school gates, looking at something, some of them laughing, some of them just gawping at the sight of a lad dressed entirely in a school uniform except for one crucial piece of it, his trousers. And it turned out to be Lewis. From what I heard, he had been basically pushed out of the car by who we assumed to be his dad, and rumors went flying around that Lewis hadn't quite been ready to leave the house when his dad was ready to take him to school that morning. Instead of waiting for him to put his school trousers on, Lewis's dad had just dragged him to the car and taken him to the school with no pants on, basically to teach him a lesson to be ready on time. I'm not entirely sure how true that reasoning was, but I do know that I witnessed Lewis having to walk into school in nothing but a school jumper, his shoes, and his underwear with my own eyes. I'm also not entirely sure how Lewis was still allowed to live with his evidently abusive parents either. Again, rumors went around that they'd had a visit from social workers, but this I believe because for a while there seemed to be little in the way of serious incidents coming from the Prestige household. Obviously, the visit from Child Welfare Services has been enough to shake them up into changing their ways, or so it seemed. Now, this all came to a head when I was 15, maybe just over a year before we left secondary school and bid farewell to compulsory education for good. One morning, Louis turns up to school in his own clothes, a pair of pumps and a colorful jumper. He gets pulled aside by a teacher who I think at that point was well aware of the situation at home, and Louis says something quietly to him before the pair of them disappear into the building which housed the main office. The next thing I know is that apart from the shoes he was wearing, Louis has an entirely new school uniform. New blazer, new tie, new jumper, everything. And from that day on he seemed like almost an entirely new person. He didn't get dropped off at school by his parents anymore. He seemed more confident and open, more talkative with other kids. He even started playing football with us at lunchtimes, something he'd never done before. We actually got quite pally with him for a while, and on more than one occasion, he invited us back home with him to play. We politely declined, of course, thinking of some made-up excuse not to have to go around the Prestige House. But still, things seemed to be making a vast improvement. Emphasis unseen, though, because after a long bank holiday weekend, Louis failed to turn up to school at all. This didn't have anyone talking about it too much. Kids were routinely off on the odd 1 or 2 days with illness, but Louis went an entire week without showing up for school, and that really did get us talking. I don't know if it was because I was so young and naive, or I just didn't connect the dots, but I didn't think that there was any link between all the police activity around our town and Louis not being in school. One Saturday afternoon, my mom and dad called me into the kitchen and asked me if I'd been around to Louis' house at all recently. I told them no, but that I'd been invited at one point, and when I said that, my mom gave my dad this look that seemed to be a weird mix of horror and relief, like I dodged a bullet or something. Not long after that, I got word through some friends of mine that there had been a brutal double murder in the town and that someone had been arrested for it too. Our little town barely had any crime at all. I think the most serious thing to happen for decades at that point was a car theft committed by some out-of-towner. The idea that there had been a single murder, let alone two, just set the town alight, and there was much speculation over who the killer was and how the killings had come about. Looking back now, I can see why the adults might want to shield us from the whole thing, and it was only a few years later that I actually realized why the police had made such an effort to keep the identity of the murderer a secret. It's like that when a murderer is under the age of 18. When they're a minor, their identity is kept secret for as long as is able, and that's only really possible with the media because it didn't take long before the residents of our town figured out what had happened, and it was bound to trickle down to us sooner or later. The reason Louis's parents didn't seem to be around anymore, the reason he was so happy and confident and carefree was because he had killed them. He finally rid himself of the people that made his life torture. I get that, but the fact that a kid killing their own parents could make them so happy, that's something I've never been able to truly understand. The horrible thing was looking back on the events later and sort of piecing together the puzzle. For example, the day he came to school in his own clothes was probably the morning he killed them, and since he'd gotten blood on his school uniform, he had to dispose of it. All the times he'd invited us back to his place to watch TV or play football, his parents would have been dead in the upstairs bedroom, assuming that's where he'd killed them. If we'd gone round, maybe we would have been able to smell them or see flies buzzing around the bedroom door or something. We were all just one little spur of the moment, yes, from finding their bodies. Maybe if that was the case, then Louis would have killed us too. This event happened to me back in the summer of 1989 on a remote speck of land in Pawnee, Kansas, back when I was 30 years old. It was early evening and the sun was setting. There was a warm breeze outside, which I remember clearly because I had just burnt a bag of popcorn in my defective microwave and had flung open the windows to air out the kitchen. I don't remember what I left the house to go and find, but after tossing the burnt bag of popcorn into the trash, I recall exiting out the back door and walking towards the barn. I remember hearing a noise off to my left in the field, like a faint cough, but I ignored it. My mind was focused on other things, and I wasn't even remotely worried about a complete stranger could have been wandering across my property. As it turns out, I should have been, When I exited the barn and made my way back towards the house, I stopped dead in my tracks as I made eye contact with a very large and extremely unkempt bearded man, perhaps 10 yards away from me. Judging by the amount of gray on his beard, I determined him to be 60 or older. He was barefoot, wearing stained overalls in addition to suspenders over his bare torso, which struck me as being unnecessary and strange. While his body looked extremely worn down and tired, his eyes were wild and fierce and full of hunger and malice. In his right hand, he carried a hatchet. And before I could form a sentence, I already visualized in my head how many steps it would take for him to reach me. I was alone, a vulnerable young woman, with no one around for miles to hear me scream, trapped out in the open by this man who appeared to have sprung from the grass, blocking the path to my house. I'm not sure how long we stood there in silence, but I recall I was about to ask him what he wanted when the man spoke up. I remember his voice was much deeper and more elegant than I expected it to be. "I'll spare your life for some whiskey." I stammered something, I don't recall what, and the man raised his voice and screamed at me. "Whiskey." I took a reflexive step back, and the man started stomping towards me. He didn't raise the hatchet, but I'll never forget the hatred in his eyes as he closed the distance between us. That's when it happened. Blood exploded out of the side of his head, and he collapsed onto the grass, making a sound like a grunt as he hit. I might be remembering things slightly out of sequence, but I thought I heard the crack of a rifle echo after he fell, not before. I didn't stop to think or look twice. I sprinted for my kitchen, terrified that someone would fire a second shot at me. Once inside, I should have locked the door and called for help, but instead I grabbed my car keys, ran out the front door, climbed into my tiny red Volvo, and drove to the nearest police station. It wasn't until I spoke to the officer at the desk that I realized that I had blood splatter on my dress. 3 police cars escorted me home, at which point it was long after dark. They combed the area with flashlights and discovered a large pool of blood on my back lawn. But there was no body, not even the hatchet. They set up a perimeter and expanded their search. But by the time dawn came and my husband returned, they had found nothing. No trace of the bearded man or whoever had fired the rifle. They asked me multiple questions about the man and the sound of the gunshot. I suppose they were trying to determine the caliber and perhaps deduce how far away the gunman had been standing. But the incident happened so fast that there was some information that I just couldn't provide. The police brought out their hounds, who traced a scent for over a mile into our backwoods until the trail went cold, and nothing further was ever discovered or reported to me. To this day, I can't describe exactly who that bearded man was or who ended his life. My family has suspected that he might have been an escaped convict or a deranged madman, and whoever fired that shot must have been hunting him and chose to act in that moment to save my life, because I have no doubt the bearded man would have done some serious harm to me. Sometimes I can bring myself to feel grateful to the unseen shooter, but other days I feel cold inside and afraid, knowing that regardless of whatever my family reasons or suspects, I'll never know for sure if that person with the rifle had not actually been aiming at me. Everybody in school knew Natasha was different. I suppose different as being kind. When you live in a town where everyone around you acts and looks very much the same, a girl like her would, of course, stand out. I have to describe her as a goth girl, if that term is even still used. Her skin had a naturally pale tone, but she did all she could to make sure it never got any darker. The Victorian parasol she carried everywhere with her blocked out any possible ray of sun from touching her porcelain-like skin. As if her skin and 100-year-old umbrella didn't make her stand out. Her choice of clothing just made her appear stranger to most. I don't think Naughty, as we called her, owned any color but black. From her coal black hair all the way down to the tips of her patent leather boots, only the chalkiness of her skin offered any contrast. If you were to guess that she was quiet and reserved, you wouldn't be far off. When she did speak, it was only in reaction to another's rude remarks. Even then, she was a girl of few words. She had a cutting type of wit. It didn't take her long to put folks in their place. Most people never got to see her other side. This version of Naughty was terrifying and most likely the cause of her future ghoulish behavior. Before I get to the meat and potatoes of my story, I want to warn my readers. If you are triggered or get excessively upset about the subject of animals getting hurt, stop here. Although I will try to be as family-friendly in my descriptions as possible, some things just have to be said. You've been warned. With that out of the way, I'll finally get to the heart of matter. Despite knowing not everyone who looks and dresses like Naughty are capable of doing the things she did, I think that look was a reflection of how she felt inside. I could never excuse her behavior, but coming from someone who knew her rather intimately, she had to have struggled with that evil inside of her. The Naughty I knew was an intelligent and sensitive person. Nonetheless, she harbored a deep-seated anger that drove her to commit a string of unforgivable acts. I never learned exactly what caused it, but I suspect it stemmed from some form of abuse she suffered. I foolishly asked about her grandfather on one occasion. This regular everyday question caused a 30-minute tirade. Safe to say, he wasn't a good person. This is likely what led to her compulsion to have power over another living thing. I was already off at school for my first year of college. Naughty, who was a year younger than me, was a senior. We were still on speaking terms after our separation, but I had not heard from her for a few months. When I had a spare moment, I called to catch up. Her mother answered her phone instead. This naturally surprised me. My surprise soon turned to concern when I was told that Naughty wasn't around anymore. I was shocked and asked what had happened, expecting her to say that she passed. Mrs. Ellis coldly stated that Naughty had not died, but she wouldn't be free to speak to me ever again. Then she quickly said goodbye and hung up. I was confused and hungry for answers, so I called a friend who had stayed behind to work. The story I heard still chills me to this day. My friend's dad was a retired cop and still had a lot of contacts inside the department. I knew he'd probably know what happened. A lot of the details concerning her punishment were hazy, but the gruesomeness of her crimes were not. The story goes something like this. Not long after her and I separated, people's cats began to disappear. The ones that were eventually found, the bodies had been drained of their blood and ripped to pieces. Initially, the deaths were attributed to a coyote or dog attacks. With no blood found at the scene, this theory didn't hold up. A few of the wackier folks around town even claimed the deaths were the work of the chupacabra. A total of 22 pets would be lost to the cat slasher in all. Owners who had once let their cats out began keeping their pets in, and neighbors watched their fellow citizens with distaste and distrust. Then late one evening, the true culprit was caught in the act. A man was out walking his dog when he took notice of a car driving slowly up and down the street. It had passed him several times, but he assumed the driver was searching for a particular address. This changed when he turned onto a new street and witnessed the driver get out and attempt to catch a cat. When the driver realized they'd been seen, they returned to the car and sped away. It was too late, though. The man copied down the license plate number and turned it into the police. The crime that hadn't had much attention from the police until then drew much more of their interest when the car's owner was discovered. Natasha was no stranger to the police. She had multiple complaints filed against her in the past. Most were actually just baseless accusations from older people who distrusted her simply because she looked different. She's a devil worshiper and other equally stupid fantasies. However, she'd also been caught shoplifting once or twice. Fortunately for her, she had some mysterious family connection that made everything go away. Things wouldn't be any different this time. Despite admitting everything to the cops who interviewed her, often in gory detail, she would be let off with no repercussions. In fact, the press didn't even mention a suspect had been arrested despite knowing her name. All that was said made it almost as if none of it had even happened. The disappearances just stopped, and almost nobody even knew why. At first, I was in complete shock, but as time passed, it began to make sense. Naughty had always hated cats. I never discovered why, but something major had to have occurred to cause her behavior. And before anyone asked if she took this dark turn because of our breakup, just forget it. She was more than happy to be free again. In fact, I may have been the only thing keeping her from going down that path sooner. For all I know, it already started prior to our separation, and nobody had noticed. I'm guilt-free. My friend, during my visits back home, The subject was brought up a few times. One guy even said he had heard she had been drinking the blood of the cats. She wasn't beyond doing something so crazy, but the girl I knew would have thought something so ceremonial was stupid. Through the grapevine, I did eventually discover where she had gone. Mere days after her release, she was shipped off to a mental health facility out west. What happened to her after that, I had no clue. Despite the terrible and cruel things she did, I still catch myself hoping she'll call from time to time. Mostly, I just want to hear her explanation. Whether I do or not, I hope she gets the help she needs. I'd hate to know more people's pets could be in danger because she couldn't resolve the problems from her past. If she does contact me, I'll post an update. Watch this line and stay tuned. I'm just as morbidly curious as you. This happened a few weeks ago. I was hanging out with my friend Dustin, and we decided to go explore this creepy old abandoned asylum. It was a huge building, about 3 stories high. We walked past the railroad. We then continued to the old asylum. As we walked to it, I looked up and my heart dropped. From the 3rd-story window, I could see someone looking down at me and Justin. I stopped, and he asked me what was wrong. I told him to look up in that window on the right. He looked up and saw it too. We continued to stare at it for about a few seconds, before whoever or whatever it was moved out of sight. We then were deciding if we should still go in. We settled that it was just some person trying to buy drugs or something. Drug deals and teens were always in there sneaking. We went past no trespassing signs and explored the 1st level of the building. There was a lot of broken glass and graffiti everywhere. There was just one that said, "I love it when they run." Don't get me wrong, that was kind of creepy, but obviously done as a joke. So we made it up to the 2nd floor and basically the same thing there, except for an old elevator shaft that was cracked slightly open. Justin turned his flashlight on and put it in the elevator. We saw a whole lot of electrical junk, some dead birds and animals. If that wasn't freaky enough, we also heard something walking above us on the 3rd story. My heart felt like it was about to explode. I had a bad feeling about this, and I told him we should leave. He said, "Nah, it'll be fine," and he started walking up to the 3rd story. I didn't want to be left alone near the spooky elevator, so I followed behind him. We had our phones out, taking pictures of all kinds of stuff on the previous floors. As we walked up the stairs, I swear we were being followed, and I told Justin to hurry up. He went upstairs, and I wasn't far behind. What I saw on the 3rd floor of that asylum will haunt me for the rest of my life. There were pentagrams and animals all over the place. It smelled awful up there. There were some rooms in the back of the corner. Keep in mind, this is the floor we saw that thing looking down at us from. We heard what sounded like whispers coming from the middle room. We got our phones out and started taking pictures of it. After I got about 2 or 3 pics, I saw a figure step out of the room. My heart was beating so hard I swear it had come through my chest. It was the same person I was looking from the window. Me and Justin were freaking out, but we didn't dare move. About 10 seconds of staring, and it started sprinting at us screaming. I took off in a sprint down the stairs, almost dropping my phone. I ran and jumped out of the 2-story window and landed in some brush. I got up and ran some more before crouching behind some old shed. Then it hit me. Justin was still in there. I hadn't even noticed him when I ran down the stairs. I texted him and asked him where he was, but he didn't reply. I sat crouched behind that shed for about 3 minutes before I saw Justin sprinting out of that house. I jumped from behind the shed and called his name. He saw me and screamed and ran. He looked behind him. Then I looked behind him. He was being chased by 2 people. I took off down the road heading for the railroad. Dustin caught up to me. We didn't stop until we made it to the tracks. We jumped in a ditch beside the railroad and looked up to see the 2 people standing at the door of the asylum. They were watching us, but then turned and walked back inside. We ran up to the local burger place and sat down at a booth. Out of breath, we ordered some Sprite and fries. While waiting for food, I asked him what happened after I ran. He said the guy chased him, and he ran down the stairs and saw me jump out of the window, and he ran to the elevator where he found a small space behind some boxes to hide behind. He said after he sat there for a bit, the guy came down the stairs with another person. They were watching to see where we went. Then his phone went off because I texted him. He said they looked his direction and saw him. They then chased him down the stairs and out the door. And that's when I saw him and we ran. We didn't call a cop because we didn't want to get in trouble for trespassing. I don't know those guys and I don't know what they were doing in that building, but needless to say, I don't think me or Dustin will ever go back there. My sister Penny was always afraid of the upstairs at our house. She never went up there at night. Our main conversation every night went something like this. Buffy, go upstairs and find me a white sweater, black jeans, and leather jacket. The clothing items would change from night to night, but I always asked her to get her things, but she would not go up without an adult after dark. Why can't you go get them? Because something is up there. I sleep up there. Nothing's happened to me. Just wait. Someday it will. Okay, I will admit it is creepy up there. I will give you the layout. There are 2 rooms that lead into each other, no hallway, and there is an attic above and one on each side. The house is well over 100 years old, and there is a banister over the stairs, but it is closed off by a door. I remember Penny coming home from dates, and before she would take her boyfriend upstairs, she would send him up with a flashlight to check the closets and under the beds, even though I was in one of those beds. Once, when our mother asked her why she would not sleep upstairs in her room, she rattled off numerous reasons. You can see small lights come out of the closet, and you can hear footsteps and heavy breathing in the attic, and there is always a sense of being watched a little too closely. I would respond, "That's ridiculous. I had never seen or heard anything." My mom would say, "She's okay. She can sleep wherever she wants. She's not hurting anything." I think my mom knew, but since nothing was bothering me at the time, she overlooked it. Better to have 1 daughter on the couch than 2. I even took this problem to my dad, being as he was always on my side, and Mom seemed that she was always on Penny's side. Eventually, my sister got married and moved out when she was 18, and I was 11. Then I guess the ghost or whatever thought it was my turn, and this is my experience. In the attic, I would hear stomping. It was not just one attic, it was all 3 spaces. There were whispers in the closet like 2 children having a conversation. The conversation I overheard were from talking about dolls. Sometimes they were trying to figure out what happened to someone named Uncle Duffy, and sometimes it sounded as if though they were discussing how they could run away. I did not get a bad feeling from the girls in the closet. I was always being watched all day and all night and lived in a constant state of panic. When I was upstairs, every nerve was on edge. The worst thing was this big black shadow in the middle of the night was asking where Penny was. The voice wasn't the voice of a kid. It sounded like it came from someone who smoked 4 packs a day for 50 years. The black shadow asked my sister 6 times every night. When I would not answer out of fear, the shadow would throw things at me, books, figurines, even pictures. Then it was my turn to sleep on the couch, and then I understood my sister. It wasn't an excuse. She actually heard those things. I never understood why I didn't until after Penny moved out, and I was bullied by this ghost or whatever it was. That's what this entity was, a bully, something that always had to have power over us, the young powerless sisters that lived in the home. Fast forward 2 years. After Penny was gone, she had her own home. My oldest sister Jeannie couldn't afford the house she was renting due to being in the middle of a divorce, brought her 3 kids and moved in with us. Jennifer, which was 5, Kevin, who was 3, and Amanda, who was 2, which meant Jennifer would be staying with me, and we were both expected to sleep upstairs. We were woken up all the time by stomping, and when Jennifer would start to cry from being scared, I would tell her it was because the house is old and that's what old homes did. They settled at night. Exactly what my mom always told me when I heard odd noises in her home. Jennifer's 6th birthday rolls around and my mother buys her one of those creepy clown dolls. You know, the ones with a plastic head and a wire body under its clown clothes, and has the most insanely evil laugh. That clown was always going off by itself at night, never during the day. One night I decided that I had had enough, so I got out of bed and went over to take the batteries out. but when I opened the battery pack, no batteries were inside. I told my mom and older sister, but no one cared, or they thought it was an overactive imagination. Penny believed me, so the next day I got up and threw it in the attic, but it would still go off in the middle of the night. Then one day I came home when the doll was out of the attic and sitting on the chair across from my bed. When I asked who put it there, no one knew. We ended up burning that doll. Penny came and burned sage in our home. Now that I'm grown up, my kids who like to stay with my mom always tell me about their things being moved and their chargers being jerked from the wall. But I still feel that it waits to this day for Penny to come home. Maybe because she feared it the most? I don't know, but I know that that bully brought me a lot closer to the sister whom I couldn't possibly live without now. All throughout the mid to late 90s, I spent my time alternating back and forth between my parents, who had divorced when I was 6. During the summer, I preferred staying at my dad's single-story ranch-style house in a quiet cul-de-sac, as opposed to my mom's place in the city. My dad's place was much quieter and had a better feeling of privacy with its big fenced-in backyard. During the warmer months, I would enjoy sleeping with my window cracked open and my fan on. In the city, it was always too noisy to have a window open at night. I remember at the time, my dad was usually working late and would arrive home around 8 p.m. or later, so the majority of the day I was alone. I would spend my time on my dad's computer, using the dial-up internet. Back in those days, if you wanted to use the internet, you had to keep in mind that you were sacrificing your ability to use the phone. You also had to sit at a desk all day when you surfed the web. On this particular day, it was getting pretty late and I had been sitting for a while, so I decided to get up and make myself a snack. The sunlight was fading outside and it was just starting to get dark, but I didn't turn on any lights as I walked down the hallway and turned into the kitchen. Using the light from inside the fridge, I began to shuffle around looking for something to make a sandwich out of, when I heard something that made me pause. Back inside my room, I had a lamp on my nightstand that had these tiny charms hanging from the shade. Whenever I went to raise or lower my window, the nightstand would shake and the charms would make tiny wind chime type sounds. I was used to the sound, but I had never once heard it from outside my room because I was the only one who ever touched my window, and for such a small sound, I was surprised how far it traveled. There was this animalistic moment where my entire body froze, and I felt my sense of hearing dial itself up to 11 as I strained to catch every small noise coming from my room. I heard a couple of footsteps on my carpet, some muffled voices, and I heard the creak of my door opening. I let the fridge door swing shut and rushed over to the back door, but as soon as I opened it, I paused. Out the back door led to our screened-in back porch, which led outside to our fenced-in yard. Going through the screen door would make way too much noise, and whoever was now in the house would be able to catch me before I was able to unlock the gate to exit the backyard. I would have to run back towards the intruders to get to the front door, so, not knowing what else to do, I ducked into a small closet right next to the fridge, where my dad kept the vacuum. There was barely enough room inside for me to stand up straight, and I knew that if they happened to open the door, I was caught, so I kept my hand on the doorknob to hold it closed. I heard 2 sets of footsteps walking down the front hall, and suddenly somebody was in the kitchen. He wasn't even being cautious. He was just sauntering around, opening cabinets and drawers like he belonged there. I heard him open the fridge right next to me and knock a few things around inside. I heard an annoyed voice coming from the hallway. "What the hell are you doing?" The second voice responded, "I'm starving, man. I haven't eaten all day. Get out of there." The first voice snapped. The fridge door shut abruptly, and suddenly there was a tug on the handle of the closet I was hiding in. I tensed and I held the door latch firm. All the guy had to do was pull on it hard, and I would have toppled right onto the floor. "Hey, this one's locked." The voice came from right outside the door. As soon as I heard it, I knew I was done, and I mentally prepared myself to be kidnapped or murdered. The second voice came again over by the back door. "Hey, did you open this?" "No, why?" "Then somebody was just here. They must have run out back." I heard both of the intruders run out to the back porch. I could have taken that moment to run, but I was shaking so hard at me, nearly getting caught, that I didn't trust myself to try and take a step. I thought about trying to go for the cordless phone on the counter, but I remembered the dial-up internet was still using the phone line. After another few moments, the two men ran back into the house and made for the front door. I heard the front door unlock and swing open. They hadn't been out of the house for more than 5 seconds before I heard a police siren wailing as it drove past the house. Turns out my neighbor had spotted the two men walking around outside and called the cops as soon as she noticed them opening my window from the outside. They were kids themselves, really. One was 18 and the other was 19. My dad arrived home shortly after, and we ended up staying at my aunt's for the night. I was incredibly shaken for the next several days, and the smallest of noises made me anxious, and I was too afraid to be alone. Looking back now, those two kids likely would have taken off running if they had found me. They didn't even have any weapons on them. But at the time, I didn't know that, and the experience traumatized my tiny 11-year-old mind. Who would have thought on a quiet cul-de-sac with houses surrounding me on all sides, and the sun not even completely gone, that my house would be invaded? The city may be noisier, but at least at the time, it was safer. I wanted to share this story so that it will serve as a reminder to always follow your gut. Don't ever assume that just because you're in your own home and you get a strange feeling that you're just being paranoid. I'll give you an example. Several months ago, right as autumn was beginning and the days were becoming shorter, I was home alone at the house I shared with my roommate. Seasonal depression sinking in, I decided just to stay inside and have a lazy evening. I was on the couch, flipping through Netflix, when I got this overwhelming sensation that something wasn't right. It wasn't just a feeling of guilt or doubt because I wasn't being productive. It actually felt as though the world around me wasn't in perfect alignment, like something was out of place. It's the feeling you get while you're driving and one of your tires is slowly deflating. Unable to shake this feeling, I stood up, shut off the TV, and headed upstairs, not turning off any lights on the ground floor. Once upstairs, I turned on the hall light and entered the bathroom. I didn't feel like I was being watched necessarily, but I did feel this sense of invasion. I got some music playing on my phone and decided that I was going to take a shower, determined to distract myself and shake off this feeling. If I had had any pets, I would have looked to see how they were acting, but I didn't. I could only go off of how I felt, and I chose to ignore the feeling of unrest. Before I was done taking my clothes off, I thought I heard movement from downstairs. I muted my phone for a moment, but the noise didn't come again. I figured I was either hearing things or my roommate had returned home early and was downstairs. I didn't think for a moment that some stranger had entered my house. That's the type of thing that happens to other people. I forced myself not to think like that. I knew that all my doors were locked and I lived in a safe neighborhood. That's what I kept telling myself. I turned the shower on, finished getting undressed, and got inside. I stayed in the shower longer than I needed to. Being in there helped, but it didn't completely calm my nerves. As soon as I turned off the water, the feeling of invasion was back, and suddenly, I decided that I needed to be very quiet. I stepped carefully out of the shower and turned off my phone. It was then that I noticed under the crack of the door, there was a shadow of someone standing just outside, and the only thing standing between me and that person was an old wooden door and a latch lock that anyone could break if they threw their weight into it hard enough. I stared down at the shadow, and finally, I allowed myself to panic. Had it been my roommate or a family member with a spare key, they wouldn't be standing that still. They would knock on the door and announce themselves if they needed anything. I didn't even hear anyone breathing. A scenario flashed through my head of me not noticing the shadow, throwing open the door in an obvious fashion, and having a knife driven into my gut as I fell into the arms of the masked stranger. I slowly put on my shorts and my shirt and just stared at the shadow under the door, still unmoving. After another moment, I made a decision. I slowly began to open the bathroom window. I flushed the toilet and lifted on the wooden frame. I then stepped up and then hung my legs out the window. As I was sliding out fully on the roof, my head knocked against the blinds and made them rattle. I swear in that split second, my heart stopped, and I heard movement from outside the door. I looked out the window right as I heard the door crash open behind me. When I slid across the roof, I immediately let myself fall to the cold ground. I picked myself up and sprinted across my lawn, without even bothering to look back to see if anyone was chasing me. I ran to my neighbor's house, pounded on the back door until they let me in, and I called the police from my phone after they locked the door behind me. When they got there, they searched my house and discovered that it was empty, but inside every single room they found evidence of footprints and signs that someone had been rummaging around through drawers and personal belongings. The intruder had been wandering from room to room while I was in the shower. Outside the living room window, they discovered very specific DNA that indicated that he was watching me as I was laying on the couch. This guy had patiently waited for me to leave the ground floor before entering the house through the back door. He then waited for me outside the bathroom when he could have easily broken in and grabbed me. There was 1,000 things that could have gone wrong that night. I could have ignored my gut feeling. The intruder could have been less patient. I could have shut lights off behind me. He could have waited down the hall instead of outside the door. I really believe that I had 1 in 100 chance of getting out of there, and I rolled the dice and beat the odds. I should be dead. I have no idea who that guy was or why he chose my house, but I do know one thing for certain. I will never doubt my gut feeling again. Please take this to heart, everyone listening. Try to always be aware of your surroundings. Play it safe even if it feels silly, and never ignore your instincts. This event took place 25 years ago, so I apologize in advance if it's not as detailed as you like. I want to stay as true to the memory as possible and only share what I remember. If there are any questions or comments which trigger more details, I will gladly flesh it out a bit. I was 7 and my younger sister was 5, and we disembarked for the school bus hand in hand, excited about our first week of school, ready to tell Mom all about it. We'd rounded the corner for home and saw that there was no car in the driveway. Little sister was happily chatting about her teacher, new friends, and the playground, but I felt unsettled. Why was Mom gone? Mom was always waiting for us, usually with chopped fruit or veggies. She was ahead of the curve on that. The no junk food rule embarrassed me as a kid, but I'm so grateful for that now. Well, maybe just the car was gone. Silly thought, but not everyone's a genius when they're only 7. As we reached the intersection of the porch and driveway, I knew the car was gone because Mom was gone, because the front door was shut. We weren't latchkey kids, although that was quite normal in our neighborhood, but I did have a house key, just in case. I had wondered what our parents had meant, but this must be the case. I released my little sister's hand and knelt to fish the key out of the bottom pouch of my backpack. I was a little nervous, but proud I'd remembered, and when I rose to unlock the door, I froze. Looking down on us from inside the house was a figure dressed head to toe in black. To my mind now, this camouflage was so complete that there wasn't anything revealed around the eyes to indicate this person's race. I had stopped with the key in my hand, and although I had no intention of getting it now, the figure shook its head back and forth. I dropped the key and urged my little sister off the porch. I was at a loss of what to do, so I led her to the side yard, where we had a tire swing and a rope swing, and told her we would wait for Mom. This had not been part of a just-in-case conversation. When I folded myself into the tire swing, I realized I'd wet my pants. Little sister asked me what was wrong, and lying was never my strong point, so I told her someone was in the house. She looked puzzled and said, "It's just Daddy's friend." I asked her how she knew, and she answered that she just did. I told her we would wait for Mom anyways. I don't know how long we waited. I was frightened, hungry, and uncomfortable in my wet pants. Whoever was in the house left from the back door because after some time, my dog darted around the house and happily greeted us. The fence was being redone in the back, and everyone who lived in the house knew to put him on a chain rather than let him run freely and escape through the gaps. Upon Sonny's arrival, little sister was ready to go in, and I was not. We argued in the way kids do, exchanging witty insults such as dum-dum and stupid head, but I was able to win the battle due to the merit of my age. Mom finally pulled into the driveway, and Sonny and I beelined for her. I had given in to the tears I'd been repressing, and the only thing that shocked me out of my hysterics was Mom urging me to come into the house. I managed to tell her about the man in black, and little sister chimed in with Daddy's friend. And then Mom ushered us into the car, even Sunny, and drove a few blocks to her friend's house. The police were called. We were questioned together and separately, and were left with Mom's friend while she and the officers walked through the house. There had been a break-in focused on the basement, Dad's territory, and my parents' bedroom. If anything was gone, Mom didn't know what it was, and Dad feigned innocence in relation to his friend. Nothing like this has ever happened again, and when I asked Mom if she remembered it, she told me the past is better left there.